Hi, my name is Holly. I'm a program manager here at Edison Ford Winter Estates. And thank you for joining me. We're talking about the Battle of Olustee, which is the largest land battle in Florida. And after I looked it up, it is just the largest battle in Florida. And while it doesn't seem like as a, maybe people don't think of it as a major battle along the terms of times and places of Antietam or Gettysburg, I think you will find it's a pretty horrific and intense battle. And I hope you will join me and we'll get started. The Battle of Olustee, Florida's largest, I'm going to say, battle of the Civil War. And when I put these pictures up here, drawings or paintings, expect that they're not very accurate because they're based on what the artist, not that there weren't some artists that were very accurate, but usually there's something off in them, not quite how it happened. But I wanted to give you at least a feel because you can see over here, there's a pine trees. They will be fighting in a piney area. Let's go back a little bit. Florida joined the United States in 1845. 15 years later, however, it's going to leave the Union after President Abraham Lincoln was elected in November of 1860. Florida and 10 other southern states seceded from the Union, and Florida was number 3 to join the Confederacy after South Carolina and Mississippi. Former Secretary of War Jefferson Davis was inaugurated as president on the steps of the Alabama Capitol, and you know it. They don't stay there; they move to Richmond. But you get the idea. And this is 1845 when it joins the Union. Things changed, boundaries changed, counties changed. We are no longer Monroe County; we're Lee County. Monroe County is down in the Keys, and where the battle will take place will actually be in Baker County. By the way, Florida's Secession Convention adopted a new constitution, which changed the existing Florida Constitution by substituting Confederate states for United States. This is a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, at least the beginning of it. I know it's kind of faded, but that's in the president's handwriting. And President Lincoln issued that Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, as the country approached the 3rd year of Civil War. The proclamation stated that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforth shall be free. And the one thing I will mention is that you note that it says that we're held within the rebellious states. There are some border states that are still part of the Union that still have slavery. So while it was a, yes, it ends slaves for people in slavery being enslaved in Confederate states, it does not end it for everyone at that time. Though I will tell you that it was considered quite a radical move at the time, which is really heartbreaking, isn't it? When President Lincoln was campaigning for his second term, and by the way, this is him at Gettysburg, which is in November of 1863, and I just visited there a couple of weeks ago. So I just wanted to use that picture to tell you that he's going to issue something else, something that people aren't as familiar with. He's campaigning for his second term in office, and he issued the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction on December 8, 1863. The president hoped that the proclamation would unite a country at war. We're fighting against each other within our boundaries. It allowed states with at least 10% of eligible voters, that their pre-war population, so before 1861, willing to pledge allegiance to the United States to rejoin the Union. Just 10% had to be willing to do that, and they would consider them back in the Union. This offered a full pardon to those individuals that took an oath of loyalty and accepted the abolition of slavery. It also promised the restoration of all rights of property, except as to slaves, because the enslaved would be free, meaning that all land holdings and homes would be restored to the members of the Confederacy, with the exception of enslaved people. It allowed states with at least 10% of eligible voters willing to pledge allegiance to the United States to rejoin the Union. And that's his proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction. It's from the Library of Congress. You'll see how this comes into play here because it specifically affects Florida. Because I bet you're wondering, like, when am I going to get to Olustee? I promise I will. And by the way, that's a map of the area behind me where the fighting will take place. Why do I have a map of Fort Wagner here? I try to zoom in a little bit, but this is where some things start and where some men are sent from was the assault on Fort Wagner. If you've seen the movie Glory, which made people aware of it, that is where that happened there. And many of these men that are there will also be coming to Florida, to Olustee. And you can see Fort Wagner is right there. I kind of tried to zoom in a little bit. And here's this assault on Fort Wagner. Putnam right here is the leader of the 7th New Hampshire. I'm going to be talking about them quite a bit. Truman Seymour, who is a general in command. I'll talk about him as well. There you can see this is right here, Morris Island. There's Fort Wagner, Fort Sumter, Charleston. And if you go there to visit, you're not going to see much of anything because I was under some illusion many, many years ago that there might be something there, but there is not. But I think you know the story of what happened here. And by the way, these two men are going to be in command overall. General P.G.T. Beauregard, Pierre Gustave, and I'm Toulon Beauregard. They are overseeing this battle of Fort Wagner, and Major General Quincy Gilmore. I realize you don't see people posing quite like this anymore, but I keep them in your mind because they're going to come into play. This is going to lead up to Olustee. Here's Robert Gould Shaw. He's with the 54th Massachusetts. Those men go in at the beginning. He's killed at Fort Wagner. They never identified his body. They believe he was buried with his men. This is in the second wave. Colonel Haldeman Putnam, 7th New Hampshire, killed at Fort Wagner, beloved by his men. They were both beloved. We've been to, my husband and I have been to Cornish, New Hampshire to find where he is buried, but he's not buried there because he's buried in the area where he fell, we believe. And some people think perhaps they even could have been confused for each other when they were buried, though I'm not quite sure because they don't look exactly like each other. But the 7th New Hampshire and the 54th Massachusetts, they're at Fort Wagner. They will also be at Olustee. The movie Glory is not perfect. There's some, it's historic fiction, but I urge you to watch it. It's truly an amazing movie. It's the story of the men that were there. That doesn't really show the 7th New Hampshire per se that I can remember, but find out their stories. Even if there's a little fiction mixed in, it may make you want to go pick up a book and find out more. Who's this intense looking man? Well, he was at both places, and his name is Truman Seymour. During the Civil War, what was Florida's role? Florida's role was to supply the Confederacy with beef to feed the troops. They had a lot of cattle and the salt to preserve it. And if we ever wanted to talk about the skirmish that takes place here, that's one of the things that the cavalry was very upset about, was that the Union troops were raiding their cattle. And Florida has a lot of salt. It has it's a peninsula. It has a huge coastline. The Union is really going to control that, but they're not controlling inland. That's where the Confederates eventually are just going to have to focus on. In 1864, the Union Army, which controlled Fort Taylor and Fort Jefferson in the Gulf and sought to way down in the Gulf, and it's fought to extend its control over the area inland from the Atlantic coast and cut off the Confederate supply lines that ran from the Tampa Bay area through north central Florida to the Georgia rail lines. And we're going to be talking about north central Florida. Major Quincy Gilmore, commander, we saw his picture before, of the U.S. Department of the South, wanted to use a mix of black and white troops in the expedition for control of Florida. In addition to cutting Confederate supply routes, Gilmore planned to recruit freed slaves into the Union Army and to facilitate the export of cotton and lumber to the north. They had turpentine. Florida had all kinds of things that the Union Army would like. And Gilmore selects this man, Brigadier General Truman Seymour, the new commander of the District of Florida, for the operation. And I believe we go back, Gilmore is the commander of the Department of the South. I did tell you that. Here's the other commander that you're going to see most directly involved, but overseeing him is PGT Beauregard, who we already talked about. So these troops, a lot of them are coming, not all of them, but a lot of them will be coming from Fort Wagner. The Union troops that captured Jacksonville, by the way, this is the fourth time, and they are going to hold on to Jacksonville until the end of the war, were ordered to remain in Jacksonville to secure it from the Confederate forces. However, already Truman Seymour disobeyed orders and marched towards Tallahassee. While they were in Jacksonville, Seymour's troops took part in several raids into Florida's interior, beginning in early February, and I believe there was a skirmish on February 11th. These actions unsettled Confederate Brigadier General Joseph Finnegan, commander of the District of East Florida, and Finnegan had about 1,500 troops to defend Florida's essential supply lines. The Confederates need those supplies too. And he asked for reinforcements. He didn't have enough. So General PGT Beauregard dispatched reinforcements. They came from Georgia, which made his force comparable to the Union with approximately 5,000, including 4,600 infantry, fewer than 600 cavalry, and 3 batteries of 12 cannon. Seymour had 5,500 men. Truman's men quickly established a defensive line east of Lake City, Florida, which included Olustee, and remember my map, and impatiently waited the Union Army's next move. Here's something interesting. You know what's behind the troops? John Hay, private secretary to President Lincoln, pretty well-known man. He began issuing loyalty oaths to residents to attempt to form a new Republican state government in time to send delegates to the 1864 Republican Convention. Remember that loyalty oath? Of course, they wanted them back in the Union, excuse me. But we're also talking about winning an election for Lincoln. And guess what? Who else thought he could get people to sign a loyalty oath and be loyal to him? And that was the Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, who had a desire to win the Republican nomination. So there was a little bit of back and forth there. Ultimately, he ends up becoming a Supreme Court justice. So that doesn't happen. But this is going on. There's going to be a battle, and they're signing loyalty oaths. So if they get that 10%, Florida could be back in the Union. How do you think that's going to go? So here we have the Confederate, the most direct commanders here, Brigadier General Joseph Finnegan. I talked about him. Brigadier General Alfred H. Colquitt's brigade. He's going to be their tactical master. And then a list of all the troops. Here, you're going to see the names Florida, Georgia, and so on. And what's happening here? Brigadier General Truman Seymour, Commander District of Florida. And under him is Colonel William Barton's brigade. Now, there's going to be a lot of New Yorkers here. Colonel William Hawley's brigade, 7th Connecticut, 7th New Hampshire, under the command of Joseph Abbott, and the 8th U.S. Colored Troops. I have a lot more to tell you about them. And then this brigade has the 35th, the 54th, the 40th, and then we have artillery. Gilmore, while in Florida, ordered Seymour to bolster the Union defenses and only to advance with orders from him. Originally, Seymour was kind of against going. And then all of a sudden, it was like a light bulb went on, and he decided that that would be a good idea. But that would be a direct contradiction to what his commander said. Oh, these things happen in battle a lot. I'll just mention Dan Sickles at Gettysburg. Seymour proposed marching to the Suwannee River, since this railroad bridge was the key to Confederate supply because you could transport things. Gilmore objected, and he dispatched an order to stop Seymour's advance. He had already told him not to do it, but the message came too late, and Seymour and his men set out from Jacksonville towards Camp Finnegan, 8 miles west, on February 7th, and reached Baldwin on February 9th. Meanwhile, Finnegan's Confederates constructed earthworks across the Florida Atlantic and Gulf Central Railroad east of Olustee Station. And this is Seymour yet again, another view of him. So he disobeyed orders. We'll see how this is going to impact the impending battle here. And this is really not the best picture, but it's what I could find. I apologize. This is from Dickinson and his men. This is the Battle of Olustee on February 20th, as Seymour, against orders, advanced towards Lake City. And by the way, by now they're about 47 miles from Jacksonville. He approached Brigadier Generals Joseph Finnegan's Confederates, entrenched because they had built some earth up in an open pine woods near Olustee. And Seymour underestimated the size of the Confederate troops. Remember, they were originally 1,500, but now he's got them built up to 5,000. So this is kind of a loose illustration, but you get the idea of the pine. I think there's supposed to be maybe some earthworks there. The Union advanced along the railway. That's going to be the key to a lot. And a nearby pike, passing through Sanderson. And this is a picture of the depiction of it at midday. But the movement stopped when advanced Union cavalry encountered Confederate outposts on the edges here. And Union skirmishers from the 7th Connecticut marched towards the Confederate entrenchments that they had built up at Olustee through the pine forest and swamps of the area. So it's not an easy area to get through. Confederate cavalry and the 64th Georgia and the 32nd Georgia Infantry, which Finnegan ordered to support the cavalry, met the Federal advance. That's another name for the Union. And the Battle of Olustee began. This battle wasn't even supposed to be happening. And now they're fighting one. And this is a lithograph. Some people say 54th by Kurtz and Allison lithographic print of the Battle of Olustee. Some people think it's the 54th going forth. But so many things are not going the right direction or the correct depiction. But again, you get the feel for a battle scene here. Of Truman's 5,500 troops, that's what he had, there were several regiments of Black troops. Now remember, we're fighting about keeping us as one country, but we're also fighting because there were people in the Confederate States and unfortunately as well in the Union States. They're both unfortunate, not as many in the Union, that believed it was okay to enslave other people based on the color of their skin. Of Truman's 5,500 troops, there were several regiments of Black troops. And at that time, one brigade was commanded by Colonel Joseph Hawley. You're going to hear that name again, not Hawley like me, but Hawley like Hawley. And that included the 8th U.S. Colored Troops, commanded by Colonel Charles Fribley. And those men were mostly free Blacks from Pennsylvania. They had not been slaves. The other brigade, under the command of Colonel James Montgomery, was a well-known abolitionist. It included the 2nd South Carolina Colored Troops, comprised of free Blacks and enslaved men from places such as South Carolina, and Key West, Florida. And you're looking at me, or if you could look at me, we could look at each other. Wow, that's a little different where they're from, but true. That was their name. There was also the 1st North Carolina Colored Troops commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William N. Reed, and that was mustered in New Bern, North Carolina, and Portsmouth, Virginia, and made up almost entirely of former enslaved men. And I do believe the 35th Massachusetts is there. I don't know their composition as far as the number of free and former enslaved. And the 54th Massachusetts, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Hallowell, because they had lost Robert Gould Shaw, of course, at the previous battle. The 54th was mainly composed of free blacks from Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. And in the movie Glory, they do show that they do portray some of the men as being formerly enslaved, which wasn't quite accurate. But as I said, it is an amazing movie. Watch it. It's historic fiction, but it's still going to give you a feel for what happened there. There isn't a movie about this battle, however. Well, who's this gentleman? He's you can tell he's a Confederate. Confederate cavalry and the 64th Georgia Infantry and the 32nd Georgia Infantry, which Finnegan ordered in support of the cavalry, met the Union advance. Finnegan ordered most of his troops out of their trenches, with 2 Georgians, General Alfred Colquitt and Colonel George Paul Harrison, leading the right and left wings. And this is Colquitt. He is basically the tactical commander and very wise in his tactical moves during the battle. Okay, here we go here. Colonel Joseph Hawley, he's 7th Colonel of the 7th Connecticut, and he also was a brigade commander who they do end up having colonels as brigade commanders. So originally it was set up to be generals. So he will be overseeing the 8th, his own troops, and the 7th New Hampshire, commanded by Joseph Abbott. Now, their commander, Haldeman Putnam, as you know, has died at Fort Wagner. And Abbott was not quite as beloved as Haldeman Putnam. And these gentlemen don't seem to like each other very much. And there's an unidentified soldier of the 7th New Hampshire. The 7th New Hampshire was the sister regiment of the 7th Connecticut. They were sometimes referred to as the 77th New England. I forgot to put my other quotation marks there. In December of 1863, the New Hampshire regiment, like Connecticut, was rearmed with Spencer carbines. Nice weapons for the men. At about the same time, it also received many substitutes. A lot had died at Fort Wagner, and draftees. And some of them, I'm going to guess if they were substitutes, yeah, they were paid to be there. That the New Hampshire veterans, the ones that were already there, did not have a very high opinion of. Well, they had a pretty low opinion of. Unfortunately, when the regiment arrived in Florida, several of its companies were forced to exchange their Spencers for the Springfield rifled muskets of the 40th Massachusetts. The weapons they received were in bad shape. Some of them didn't have bayonets. Some couldn't even fire. So the influx of untrained soldiers along with substandard weapons, in my opinion, most likely affected their performance of the 7th New Hampshire at Olustee. They do have a regimental history, by the way. Additionally, and I'll talk about that in a minute, due to confusion around an order from Hawley, the brigade commander, the 7th retreated, at least most of them did, leaving the 8th U.S. United States Colored Troops isolated. And by the way, I can't remember if I mentioned it later on, so I'll tell you now. The 8th U.S. Colored Troops had 1 month of training. They were brand new. And the 8th had their colonel, Charles Fripley, mortally wounded. He was killed at the battle. It was pretty much a disaster. And this is a map I found on one of the Olustee sites. So you can see where the 7th Connecticut is. You could see where the 8th, the 54th, and New Hampshire would be most likely in here. But what happens is, and by the way, the 7th Connecticut was ordered to go back, fall back, and New Hampshire men are out here, and they're going out here, and they're by themselves when they decide to, when they retreat. It was just a mess, a dangerous situation here. And I'm going to read a little bit. I think I'm going to go backspace here because I'm going to read to you a little bit from a really nice book. You're probably not going to be able to see this very well, but this was written by my husband. Yep, it's a shameless promotion. It's no longer in print, but you can find it on Amazon and eBay. It was published by the University of South Carolina Press, and it's called Men of Granite, New Hampshire Soldiers in the Civil War. I'm just going to read a little bit. It has a lot more information than I can read right now, but he's going to talk about that order to exchange rifles. So we'll see what he says here. When the order came down to exchange rifles with the 40th Massachusetts, Colonel Hawley could have effected the change within his regiment, the 7th Connecticut, but he didn't. But he made the 7th New Hampshire give up its rifles instead. The seeds of ill will between Hawley and Colonel Joseph Abbott of the 7th New Hampshire had already been sown before the battle. The exchange of rifles within the 40th Massachusetts took place February 13th near the town of Sanderson. I showed you that picture of them rolling through the town. They were now about 50 miles, 47 miles from Jacksonville and penetrating deeper into the interior of northern Florida. There's some really good stuff in here. I just want to read you just a little bit more. The Battle of Olustee, or Ocean Pond, as the Confederates knew it, began on February 20th when 2 companies of the 7th Connecticut, which had been thrown forward as skirmishers, made contact with a unit of Confederate cavalry. The rebel horsemen immediately fell back 3 miles towards Olustee and their prepared positions. Seymour moved his men, remember, their commander there, Truman Seymour, moved his men forward, and when it was reported that a large number of the enemy was ahead, he brought up a battery to probe the position. The return fire of the Confederates promptly answered the Union artillery. Fighting intensified around 3 o'clock when Seymour brought up the rest of the 7th Connecticut. The regiment still retained its carbines and was able to do good work against Brigadier General, the Confederate hero, Alfred Colquitt's Georgians, until the center of the 7th Connecticut became too extended to the front, and they had to be withdrawn. But just as the Connecticut men fell back, the reinforcements that Colquitt had asked for arrived. Now he's got the 6th, the 64th, and the 28th Georgia on the north side of the railroad, and the 19th Georgia on the south side. Seeing this deployment, Seymour had Hawley bring up the rest of his brigade that included the 7th New Hampshire. The New Hampshire men moved up to support a battery, and then disaster struck. To this day, historians are still trying to understand what made the 7th New Hampshire Regiment totally disintegrate under fire and flee to the rear. The answer most likely lies in a combination of variables involving Colonel Abbott, Colonel Hawley, the newly arrived substitutes of the 7th New Hampshire, and the bad rifles the regiment had been given. In his report, Colonel Hawley stated that the brigade met the skirmishers of the 7th Connecticut, falling back. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. He says, I distinctly ordered the 7th New Hampshire to deploy on the 8th Company. Somebody, which would have brought the left of the line near the pond. Somebody must have misunderstood the order, for a portion of the regiment was going wrong when myself, staff, and Colonel Abbott repeated it vigorously but vainly. And And honestly, I won't keep on reading it, but now it seems like they're giving conflicting orders as well. And everyone goes in wrong directions. The remainder of the company drifted back, suffering from the fire, which a few moments before decision and energy would have checked, if not suppressed. Hawley accused Abbott indirectly of not doing enough to rally the broken ranks, although elsewhere in his lengthy report, he praised Abbott. He did all in his power to rally his command. Abbott may have done everything he could, but the origins of the panic retreat of New Hampshire were in the original deployment, and that would have been the command of Hawley, not what was done afterward. In Abbott's report to Hawley, he stated, the order was given by myself to deploy upon the first company, and the deployment commenced. But remember, I think it was back here that Hawley said deploy the 8th company. Herein lies the mistake. Abbott should have known that his deployment would mean that the left flank of his regiment would now be in the air. There's no protection there, rather than firmly anchored on the pond, and chaos now reigned on the field, and only about 100 men of the 7th remained to exchange fire with the Confederates. They do try to rally it, and for 1/2 hour, I'm just going to skim forward here, that after the 7th New Hampshire fell apart, its officers tried to rally it, and while it was being reformed, the New York troops were brought forward on the right of the Connecticut troops. And there's so much more to this story. I urge you to read the book and read more about the 7th New Hampshire and about the 54th Massachusetts, and all the U.S. colored troops were there. Of those who've been posted, 184 from the New Hampshire troops had been deployed too close to the Confederate line. It's documented there were 164 New Hampshire of the 500 missing. It's been documented of that number, 112 were taken to Andersonville Prison in Georgia. I think you all know what that was like. And 43 of them died of causes such as chronic diarrhea and scurvy. The last thing I will say is from another book, he quotes Confederate Florida, talking about the 7th New Hampshire at the Battle of Olustee, to have them attempted to deploy too close to the enemy's lines while under fire after their leaders had given them conflicting orders, borders on criminal. A crucial stage of the battle was the breaking of the 7th New Hampshire, a setback which could have been prevented. And there's always this back and forth between Hawley and Abbott. But there's a lot of troops that perform amazingly, admirably on the field that day. And I'll leave it to you to decide who was at fault. Was it the men? Was it a combination? Was it Hawley? Was it Abbott? It's going to be the subject of controversy for many years to come, but unfortunately men died because of not understanding the orders. Let's talk about these men. Well, this is some men that they were recruiting up in Philadelphia to join the ranks of the United States colored troops. The 54th Massachusetts, with the 1st North Carolina, played a central role in the battle by holding back the Confederates as the rest of Seymour's regiments withdrew. They're all leaving the field. The 54th is helping with the rear. So is the 1st North Carolina. The newly formed 8th USC, United States Colored Troops, USCT, with only a month's training, faced some of the heaviest fighting. They were ordered forward and ran into a hail of Confederate fire, and some were said to have no ammunition. There was a shortage. I find that absolutely appalling, that untrained men without adequate ammunition were sent into battle. At the end of the battle, and there were a lot of them, by the way, a lot of the 8th did come from the Philadelphia area. The 8th USCT lost more men than any other Union regiment in the battle. They lost 5 color guard and 3 sergeants. Of the missing, several became prisoners and were sent to Andersonville, like I read in Dwayne's book. Others were captured by Confederate soldiers and killed. And that had been a fear of the men. They weren't all killed, but many were. Others were taken prisoners, as I mentioned, and they were first sent to Tallahassee. And in mid-March, then they were sent to that horrible place, Andersonville. And the U.S. colored troops were also assigned the duty of burying many of the men that died there. I would guess that the 7th New Hampshire, that had many men there, would be among them. So a horrific experience for all these men. And you will read that in other places, the 7th Connecticut was also helping with the rear to guard against Confederates. So here we've got a little chart. This is how many forces total, 10,500. This is always approximate. 5,500 Union. This is how many wounded, killed, and missing casualties. There's the Confederate troops right there. There's their casualties. This is the estimated total casualties. This figures out about to 34% of the Union troops were killed. It certainly was a heavy price to pay for Truman Seymour not following orders. This is about 19%, I believe, of Confederate troops. Just a little summary here. Finnegan sent forward the Confederates here, 1 brigade to meet Seymour's advanced units. The Union forces attacked, but were repulsed. Seymour, believing he was attacking Florida militia units, he didn't know he was actually facing Confederate troops, sent his forces in piecemeal. The battle raged, and as Finnegan committed the last of his reserves, I mean, he was at the end, but guess what? The Union line broke and began to retreat. Finnegan also, though they won the battle, he did not fully exploit the withdrawal and follow them. Some of his men attempted to gauge the rear of Seymour's forces before nightfall, and that's from battlefields.org, which has a lot of really interesting things about Olustee. There's also some Olustee sites. I could go so much more into depth about this. There's a lot more to say, but see, again, I'm going to say other troops that were also forming the rear guard. You'll find the 7th Connecticut, the 1st North Carolina, and the 54th Massachusetts I mentioned before. The one thing I found in Civil War history, the overall general picture is the same, most of it, except the part about the 7th New Hampshire and those orders. That's really hard to understand, but there's always some difference in the remembrances of the history. But I would say that's history. It's never as clear. You're always uncovering things. It's very fluid, but I wanted you to get the basic idea about this battle. But all those troops formed the rear guard as the Union Army retreated east, and they protect them. It could have been far worse, believe it or not. And Brigadier Alfred Colquitt, who was in tactical command at Olustee, I showed you his picture before. He's called the hero because he helped win that battle for the Confederates. He brings his reinforcements. The fighting ended at sunset, and it lasted, and I put ... Okay, this is another thing. I went so many places. I saw 3 hours. I saw 4 hours, saw a lot of 4 hours, saw a lot of 5 hours. I saw 6 hours. I saw different times for sunset. It lasted a few hours. I'm not going to know. I don't know exactly. It depends on whose account you want to use. The Union will retreat to Jacksonville. They don't venture inland again. They, kind of give up on the idea of going inland. And Florida didn't rejoin the Union. Even they didn't get the 10%. They don't join the Union. But some does anything, what happens at Jacksonville is it becomes a route for enslaved people to go through towards freedom. That was a place where a lot of them met up. And I'll let you decide about Truman Seymour. Well, that's nice when something jumps on your screen. Here we go. I don't know what happened there. After the battle concluded and the troops withdrew, a train transporting wounded Union soldiers broke down. Rather than leaving the wounded men stranded and possibly captured, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment tied ropes around the locomotive to pull it by hand across the railroad tracks. Can you imagine? They pulled it for 3 miles until they acquired troops at Camp Finnegan to help pull the train. Well, they acquired horses, excuse me, to help the troops pull the train another 10 miles to Jacksonville. There were 300 wounded soldiers that went to Beaufort, South Carolina on the steamer Cosmopolitan. Can you imagine what had happened to the wounded? And if they were still on that train? And that is a picture of that from the National Museum of American History, the 54th Mass pulling that locomotive. According to some Confederate memoirs and letters, Confederate troops, and I mentioned this before, killed most of the wounded and captured Black soldiers. I'd mentioned that they captured some soldiers, but here it's also telling you that it was believed they captured many. Here are some men of the 54th Massachusetts. Here's a picture of Robert Jones. He was a farmer from Hamilton, Ohio. He joined the soldiers in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. He went missing in action in the Battle of Olustee and is believed to have died as a prisoner of war, most likely at Andersonville. Some accounts say that he died in the battle, but more said he died at Andersonville. There was also a man, the 54th Massachusetts, that had won the Medal of Honor at Fort Wagner. And back then, it doesn't happen right then. It happens many years later. He receives his in 1900. Andersonville Prison, one of the worst. I mean, Union, we also had horrible prisons, but this one had a particularly bad reputation. And I believe the commander of that, the man overall in charge, died because of what he did there. This is 184 of the 506 that were there that day that were captured were from the 7th New Hampshire. That's a pretty high number. From that battle, 184 of the 506, 43 died there. I'm going to confess that I have not been back to Olustee probably 20, 21 years. Last I knew it's a state-run battlefield. We're thankful that there's the stories of the people that fought there, the stories of the men fighting for their freedom. That's all very important. This is run by the state of Florida. It is smaller, just a few acres, not a larger battlefield like Gettysburg, but I would say that you should still go visit it. This does seem have a Confederate focus, if I am remembering correctly. I have not been for a long time, so things could have changed. Though as I looked it up, it seems like that is somewhat similar. So there's Olustee, about 47 miles from Jacksonville. This monument was most likely placed between 1910 to 1915. and it talks about it was a tribute to the Confederates, all the battalions that were there. This monument was erected to perpetuate in loving memory the 151 soldiers of the Confederate Army who lost their lives at the Battle of Olustee, and now who lie buried in Oak Lawn Cemetery, Lake City, Florida, which was right near there. February 20th, Olustee Battle, 1864. And it says bodies lie 10 blocks northwest from this monument in Oak Lawn Cemetery. So there's one Confederate monument. This monument was erected in 1912 by the United Daughters of the Confederacy on land purchased in 1909 by the state of Florida to preserve a portion of the battlefield. With the purchase of this land, Olustee became Florida's first state historic site. And that is from University of North Florida's Digital Commons. Here's another monument. The Battle of Olustee was fought on this ground February 20th, 1864, between 5,000 Confederate troops commanded by General Joseph Finnegan and 6,000, it was actually 5,500, but they used math and rounded up, troops under General Truman Seymour. The Federals, the Union, were defeated with a loss of 2,000 men, approximately. They rounded up. The Confederate loss was less than 1,000. Following the end of the Civil War, the Olustee battlefield site was virtually forgotten. In 1866, a U.S. Army detachment under the command of Lieutenant Frederick Grossman visited the battlefield to collect the remains of the Union soldiers that had been hastily buried on the field in 1864, and he found the remains of some 125 soldiers, placing them together in a mass grave. At Gettysburg, you'll see the little markers, some by state, saying unknown, like unknown New Hampshire with the number, and there's kind of a general unknown. All this is just really heartbreaking because they don't even know what states they're from. These are just mass grave for 125 soldiers. I would say that they were also unknowns. And a 12-foot high wooden monument was placed over the site, and the area was surrounded by a fence. Among the inscriptions added to the monument were the words, "To the memory of the soldiers, officers and soldiers of the United States Army who fell in the Battle of Olustee, February 20th, 1864. And this is in a cemetery. It's not actually on the battlefield. There is no monument to the Union troops on the battlefield. There is an area that has a little overview, more modern, about the battle and what happened there. In 1991, a replica of this monument was erected where the original monument is believed to have been. As no record exists to indicate their removal, it is thought by most students of the battle that the remains of the Union dead are still located in a mass grave in which they were buried in 1866. And this is from the battleofolustee.org site after the battle. And there's just a very sad sight. Next month, let me go back for a minute. I just want to tell you that this is part of your Florida history. I know you all know that. And if you're not from Florida, this is still an important Civil War battle. Men fought, men died here. I need to go back. You need to visit, read up about it. I hope I've piqued your interest. My state of New Hampshire, I'm a New Hampshire person. The 7th New Hampshire, we won't ever quite know. But those men conducted themselves at Fort Wagner quite well. And you can keep pondering Truman Seymour. Okay, what's happening next month in December? The Wizard and Wall Street. Go to our website and you'll see it after tomorrow. December, click on the calendar. Edison, the Stock Ticker. That's by Program Manager Ryan Boyer. Boy, are you going to learn a lot. And does he have a great presentation for you? Next month, I'm going to talk about Tootie McGregor Terry, benefactor of Fort Myers, neighbor of the Edisons, helps Harvey Heitman. Do you know about Terry Park? There's so much to learn about her. I hope you'll join me. Go to the December calendar. And here's just a few references. A lot of websites. There's a lot out there. I urge you to read it. Let me see. I thank you for joining me, and I will see you next month. Thank you.